You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's special episode of Event Horizon, John is joined by Dr. Irving Finkel. Dr. Irving Leonard Finkel is a philologist and Assyriologist. He is the assistant keeper of ancient Mesopotamian script, languages, and cultures in the Department of the Middle East in the British Museum, where he specializes in cuneiform inscriptions on tablets of clay from ancient Mesopotamia. He earned his PhD in Assyriology from the University of Birmingham under the supervision of Wilfred G. Lambert, with a dissertation on Babylonian exorcistic spells against demons. He was a research fellow at the University of Chicago Oriental Institute. In 1976, he returned to the UK and was appointed assistant keeper in the Department of Western Asiatic Antiquities at the British Museum, where he was and remains responsible for curating, reading, and translating the museum's collection of around 130,000 cuneiform tablets. In 2014, his study of a cuneiform tablet that contained a flood narrative similar to that of the story of Noah's Ark, described in his book, The Ark Before Noah, was widely reported in the news media. He is also the founder of the Great Diary Project, a project to preserve the diaries of ordinary people in association with the Bishopsgate Institute. For more information on the Great Diary Project, check the links in the description below. And now, sit back, relax, for you have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier.
Dr. Irving Finkel, welcome to the program.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Now, Doctor, you are a curator at the British Museum, and my a very young version of myself in the 1990s, leaving North America for the first time, going to Britain. One of the first places I went was the British Museum, and I was overwhelmed with history and the collections. And I remember specifically seeing, Mesopotamia.
Yes.
And of course, Egypt and the Rosetta Stone and things like that are there. But figuring out languages from the past and trying to figure out writing systems, the very earliest writing systems. How did we get from things like cave paintings in France, 32,000-year-old paintings of animals and, some think dots and dashes that might mean something, seasonal, this animal breeds at this point. There are those hypotheses. But how do we go from that to pictographic writing and then recording sound with letters, for lack of a better term, in cuneiform in Mesopotamia?
Well, that is the outline of the process as we understand it. But the trouble is, if one has a linear process of this kind, starting at one point and going forward, the thing to remember most of all is that any construction we make of a linear type is based on the most imperfect evidence, because you run from the Paleolithic right up until historical times and into the centuries of AD and so forth. If you're looking at mankind up to modern times, in terms of real history, it's only a blink of a moment. But the whole story, which runs over thousands of years, is only accessible to us with points of light in the darkness. And sometimes they are clustered and they look meaningful, and sometimes they're isolated, and we never know what they stand for. So to jump from cave paintings into writing is quite a leap. But the first thing about those paintings, a point which people don't seem to make, which seems to me of paramount significance, is that the ones I've ever seen or seen reproduced exhibit a level of artistic mastery which is absolutely extraordinary, because they are able to paint animals accurately portrayed, as it were, from a physical point of view, in motion. And this is really one of the hardest things to do. If you give an adult a large sheet of paper and a pencil and tell them to draw a horse, they won't be able to do it. They won't know where to start. And then when they've done one leg, they'll try and rub it out before you notice because they got it wrong, because it goes in instead of goes out. And to draw a leg of an animal which seems to possess not only its muscular structure, but also movement or incipient movement, represents a level of draftsmanship which is extraordinary, considering it's at the outset of the whole process, because everybody knows about Rembrandt and Van Gogh and people who are born artists, and they can draw likeness and they can do this and they can do that. But we find at the beginning of the time, not long after Homo sapiens becomes Homo sapiens, after all its very great ancestry, there are people who can do these extraordinary paintings. So this, to me, is a singular matter, because they obviously had talent in the modern sense of the word. And you don't find walls with half-tried animals and practice attempts and let's see how this goes and who can remember what a giraffe looks like. There's nothing like that. They're all finished works. So there are two things about that which I find extraordinary. One is that at the outset, as I say, you have this highly accomplished level of draftsmanship. And the other point is that I wonder how it functioned. I mean, if you look at the books and look at things on the internet, you get the impression that every cave there's a big fire, lots of hairy grandmothers and grandfathers and parents and thousands of children gnawing at the bones of animals and trying to evolve. And the obvious implication is that among every single one of these clusters, one of them is a Leonardo. Well, I find this very strange indeed. So I have a working idea, which I'm sure all prehistorians will laugh at, that perhaps when you have a country where there are these miscellaneous caves distributed around the place, like you find in Europe, perhaps there were itinerant artists. That's to say, someone who, by some natural freak of something, turned out to have this extraordinary ability which amazed everybody when they did it. When they drew an antelope, even the smallest child would know it was an antelope because it was so realistic. If you had this criterion, I wonder whether there weren't in antiquity master artists who travelled from place to place and did a wall here and did a wall there. I know this might sound like a completely fantastic idea, but actually, if you were such an artist, what would you do in your cave if you'd done all the walls already? You'd go nuts, and everybody would want walls. And of course, people at the dawn of history might not be exactly the same as they are in a crowded bus in Manhattan, but basically the animal is more or less unchanged. And I think one has to imagine that you have people in this environment who are infinitely more capable than their peer group with this remarkable capacity, and that is painting. So I know about these ideas, that there are marks at the bottom which are supposed to be a message about seasons. I don't know myself whether it's true. I don't know. I've never really studied it, but one of the things is that when you have an array of marks which are supposed to convey meaning according to a system, one point about it is you cannot have loads and loads of them. And I don't know how many there are in, for example, the best repertoire that's been discovered, how many actual signs there are. Because the number of signs obviously bears on their usage. And the second thing is, when you have simple things, which, for example, an upright with a diagonal off it, and an upright with another diagonal off it, things like that, these are not only rudimentary and simple, but they are generic marks, which is to say that anybody who makes marks or was told to make marks would come up with these things. And the third problem about them, which seems to me very serious, is how you tell mark A from mark B from mark C if they are done like this. Sometimes the ones I've looked at seem to be fairly neat, but you'd have to have a system. You couldn't have a whole writing system in one community and a whole different one in another community, because obviously if it's following animals and if it is that panoply of information, then there'd have to be some kind of agreement about what the marks meant. So it all needs to be studied, and I think there's been more pronouncements about the system and how it works before all the evidence has been collected, and what the relative date of these things is and so forth. But I wonder whether it is not possible that you have a differentiation in ability from the masses, from the people who could certainly draw and paint like angels, but also for them, maybe they had a communication system, something like there was a time when beggars used to mark signs outside houses to tell them whether the person had a dog or whether they were generous and that kind of thing to people who came after them. So there, even in the modern world, there are rudimentary marking systems which convey meaning. And I don't for a minute say that these aren't those things, but frankly, I've never really investigated them. So this is the very, very deep background to writing. But the point it does raise, which I think is so important, that if these marks are made deliberately by human beings to communicate one meaning to another human being and they understand it, then this is also a very, very significant matter. And it means that the first grasping towards writing the pictographic sort of material you were talking about from Mesopotamia, which is so many thousands of years later, is not really a huge advancement over that. It is extraordinary that the first signs that we get from cuneiform seem to be pictographic in function. And when you say pictographic, you have a process that a person who's a competent exponent of the writing system, in this case it would be writing with a point on the surface of clay, you would do a drawing of a leg, which means to run, and you do a drawing of a wiggly thing, which meant water, and many other things like that. And they all are self-explanatory. They have a convenient abbreviation for a woman, which nobody would doubt what that meant, and all sorts of other things, where when you saw these pictographic symbols, you would understand what they meant. And there is a general consensus that these signs evolved from the pictographic to having a phonetic use and then being able to write language. And this is often portrayed as a stark model for what happened all over the world. Well, the fact is, it's impossible to find another case apart from ancient Mesopotamia. It was the first one they understood, and it became the role model for everybody else. But in fact, you can't document parallels to this principle. But the other thing is, I don't agree with it, because we have from about 3300 BC onwards a lot of these very pictographic signs, elementary signs. And then what happens is you have a graphic evolution whereby the simple stark pictographs are made more fluent, they're made more they're less curvy, they're made more rigorous in shape, and they develop, they get more complicated. You have a sign with another one inside, or you have one next to another one. You can see that you've got stage one, which is simple pictures. Then you have the evolution of the signs, and then you have the idea that these signs could be used to convey the sound of what they are portraying. In other words, a sign, when you see it, it puts a noise in your ear. And once you have this idea, then you can use all the signs to write grammar and vocabulary and language. So that's the kind of model. But the thing is this. I have come to the conclusion that the earliest horizon of pictographic writing in Mesopotamia was nothing to do with the Sumerian language, which is the Sumerian language, which is the oldest one, or the Babylonian language, which came after. I think that this early array of signs was designed to communicate with other persons whom you shared no language with. So you have a situation in southern Mesopotamia where there's irrigation, and there's lots of livestock, and there's lots of this and lots of that. And even at the beginning, in the fourth millennium, there were people who traded very long distances. Eventually, they went freely to India. They came back. They went all the way across the mountains. They went all over the place. And there was trading, and people who had lapis lazuli, if they walked 500 miles and ended up somewhere else, they could produce a little bag of lapis lazuli and be given all the gold they wanted, or all the barley they wanted, and so forth. So barter, when humans could walk and they had the eye on the main chance, was immersed. They were immersed in what became the overriding human activity, which is commerce. And this comes right at the beginning of the whole bipedal process. So I think that there was a very realistic conception that if Highlanders came, for example, to your town and you didn't know any vocabulary, you couldn't speak, they had a foreign language, so you can do this like you do if you meet somebody in another country. You do your best. Would you like a cigarette? Shall I light a match? And all this kind of stuff. You can do all that. But if you had a network of signs that everybody knew, you could write very sophisticated messages. So you could say, you could write a message, we want 3 sheep to be brought across the water to this house by the man. You could draw those, and then that would be a kind of means of communication between people who didn't speak languages, common languages. And I think this is a realistic thing which has never been proposed for the whole process of the evolution of writing, but I believe it to be correct because of this. Sumerian, by about 3,300 BC, we can use that the early cuneiform signs are beginning to reflect the Sumerian language. In other words, we've been able to work out some of the phonetic values. We can see they are Sumerian words, and we can tell that the early cuneiform signs, which are somehow connected with the pictographic signs, actually were used to spell Sumerian words. This was the giant and important matter, and it's often celebrated as the great leap for mankind, but in my opinion this is also a load of hogwash, because it's pretty obvious that you can draw something for a picture. For example, I can never think of anything on the spot at the moment, but for example, T in Sumerian means life, and it also means arrow. And if you were an Englishman, you went in and you drew an arrow, they would say T, and you say, yes, yes, T, things like that. And small children, when they begin to learn to write, they make puns, and they understand how language works, that things that sound similar and that things represent sounds. It's a part of a human evolution on a personal scale. So I think that the idea that you had signs which firstly were just simple, they meant milk bottle, Mars bar, football boot, something like that. But then you wanted to say that I need 2 of these football boots, and the Mars bar was moldy last week, I didn't like it, and all this, and you want to write grammar and sentences, that you have to use the signs to spell out words by the ear. And there are lots and lots of puns. And the idea that the person who first thought of this was the genius, like nobody else, how genius they were, what a pity they can't get an OBE, is a load of hogwash, because it's obvious, it is utterly obvious that if you have a world with marks and symbols used for communication, you might start off with ideas, but in a community where you have the shared language, the ideas thing becomes fatuous, and then you use things to gradually, I'm me, this is, you find a word for I, and then the word for you, and in the writing, not in the language, because they must have had language for thousands of years. The Neanderthals must have had language, and surely they had poetry, because all these things are very ancient. So to answer your question, in Mesopotamia, you have these first signs, about 3,500 and onwards, and the first language we can see is Sumerian, which is about 3,200, maybe. And Sumerian is a proper language in the sense that all modern languages that we know are proper languages. It's no really different, except it's barbarically difficult to understand for one very important reason, that there are no relatives. So everybody knows that if you study Latin and then you do Spanish and Italian and French, you have a kind of structure in your mind of the Indo-European language as it works, and what the feminine is like and what the verbs are like, and so forth and so forth. You have a framework where individual languages in a group are easily identified. But the thing is, with Sumerian, is there's no language, either ancient or modern, which has the faintest real connection with it as a language. So this is a peculiar phenomenon. And the explanation is as follows, that Sumerian is the first language we can identify through archaeology. So it must be that in untold millennia before the horizon when we identify Sumerian, there were languages in the world, in the Middle East, across into Russia, God knows where, all over Asia. There were places in the world where people must have spoken languages which were related to Sumerian, a big family group of languages, exactly like Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian in our world. In other words, writing came on board. The horizon of writing is just in time to scoop up this language before it became extinct, like all the others. So we got the last one of the Sumerian group. And the mad thing that happened in Mesopotamia was that the scribes who got their teeth into this system really developed the most beautiful writing matter, where they could record all the nuances and fluencies of fluent questions of their language, both in Sumerian and then later in Babylonian by about 2800. There were lots of Semitic-speaking people who poured into Iraq, and they spoke a Semitic language which we call Akkadian. And the whole same writing system, as it developed into a proper tool, was used to write Sumerian and Akkadian. And you can't tell from the writing unless you read it what it is. So then you have these two languages, completely unrelated, written with the same writing system for about 3,000 years. And they wrote in clay, which is marvelous because when it was buried, it survived to modern times in the ground. So all in all, it's a smashing case study and invaluable. But the trouble is we cannot extrapolate from it that this is a general principle because there's hardly any collateral information. And my own idea is that things are much more complex on the one hand, much more simple on the other, and that all sorts of things were going on, and that people were always interested, so that the idea of writing, once someone spotted it, they would think, God, this is really an extraordinary thing, and they would go home, and perhaps they couldn't quite remember how they did it, but they know in principle, so they would start over. And it's very likely, for example, that Egyptian writing, hieroglyphic writing as it became, owes its inception to this kind of matter, because it looks as if the earliest texts that we have are older than Egyptian, but somebody, for example, in a trading matter, or possibly even in matter of warfare or political scrabbles, because all these things went on in ancient times as well, of course, encountered this cuneiform writing system and discovered you could have a sign that made this sound and a sound that made this sound, and they had their own sounds, and they thought, heck, we can do that. And they went home and they decided to do it beautifully and write little birds and little whatsits and everything. It looked so lovely. And actually, if you look at Egyptian, you never think it's anything to do with cuneiform. But in point of fact, the principles behind how it works are very similar. So it's very hard to believe that all these things are unrelated. But on the other hand, clever people invent things from scratch whenever they fancy. So we don't know. But the point is, it's like looking over the sea at night, and you can see a rowing boat with a lamp, and you can see maybe a liner with lots of windows miles and miles out to sea, and you can see another light here. And that's the sort of information network we have in the whole span of really ancient times and the evolution of man and the society that we now put up with.
In regards to your hypothesis about multiple languages, cuneiform has two languages, correct? And they aren't related?
Not at all.
And so it actually serves as an alphabet for two different languages in the same area.
Not an alphabet, because
not an alphabet.
The alphabet is a very neat invention whereby you have 26 or so graphic symbols with which you can write all the words in a language. It's really quite an economical invention. But prior to the invention of the alphabet, you have syllabic writing where you write, you don't have A, B, C, and D. You have ab and ba and da, ad and da and d and do and all those sorts of things. You have a consonant with a vowel next to it, either in front or behind. And you have to learn all these syllables in order to spell the words. But it became, if you went to school and you were trained, usually by being beaten, to being attentive and learning your stuff, you could use cuneiform to write Sumerian, which you had to learn, and Babylonian, which you spoke. But also, you might have to write other things as well, because throughout the millennia, the Babylonian writing system was used by many other languages as well. It became, in fact, Babylonian became what we call a lingua franca in the Middle East. So even the pharaoh in Egypt, who wanted to communicate with the outlying districts that are supposed to be paying him tribute, or where there was trouble on the roads and everything like that, they would communicate in this cuneiform writing in the Babylonian language. And that functioned internationally, and they all had to have everything translated, both ends of the mixture. But as Sumerian is an isolate, as you might call it, the Babylonian language is securely identifiable as a Semitic tongue like them, it's completely gone. It's of course extinct. But the language we can know very well now, very well understood, is related to Arabic and Hebrew and Ethiopic and Syriac and Aramaic in the modern world, where this number of Semitic languages and others too still flourish. It's a very important group. So you have Indo-Europeans like Latin, Greek, Spanish and Italian, and then you have the Semitic group like Arabic, Hebrew and so forth and so forth. And Babylonian is an earlier case, an earlier example of what the Semitic group that we know about. And in antiquity, there was also a group, Ugaritic and what have you, a group of 4 or 5 ancient Semitic languages which had the same sort of relationships one to another as modern Semitic languages do in the modern world. So the phenomena of language, the phenomena of many of the basic phenomena of language are common and unchanging. Of course, you have all manner of details which are very individual and very specialist, but in general, the truths, the deep truths about language and the rules that govern them are very often a kind of universal human property, which is, of course, not surprising.
It's amazing how certain things translate, as in Arabic and Hebrew being related to these ancient Semitic languages, but also stories. And one of those is something you've worked extensively with, is the flood myth.
Yes.
That you see this in, versions of it much earlier than, biblical. And you see it sort of morph and telescope through. However, do you subscribe to the idea that there was some event, and I'm specifically mentioning the Black Sea and breaking through the Bosphorus and it going from a lake to an inland sea? Do you think that there is some historical basis somewhere for these flood myths?
Well, the way I look at it is that from a literary point of view, the Babylonian version of the flood story is 1,000 years older than the Bible. This is the first principle to establish that, nobody knows exactly about the creation of the Bible. Some people have one view, some people have another, but there's no doubt that however early one can visualize the text of the Bible being written down on a surface, it's at least a millennium earlier that we have the sources from Babylonia. And we have the developed story and the basic story in which the gods sent a flood to wipe out human beings, and one of them relented at the last minute and he built this lifeboat and saved the life. And they started all over again when they landed. So this is the Babylonian story in outline. It's the same thing which was adopted in the book of Genesis. And it was adopted in the book of Genesis from Babylonian forerunners. We can be sure of it. Firstly, there were no floods in Jerusalem. Secondly, the landscape of Iraq, the lower southern reaches of Sumer, the southern part of the country, it has been vulnerable to flooding from the main rivers and the flow down from the mountains in the far north and so forth throughout all time. And most of the flooding has been beneficial from the point of view of crops and growing things, but periodically there have been disastrous floods, and probably in Mesopotamian memory there probably was a tsunami where the whole of Mesopotamia was overrun with water, washed down to the Persian Gulf, and all the people and the animals probably perished, and only a few people who were on the roof, so to speak, or had a boat, so to speak, survived. So I think if you read the cuneiform inscriptions to do with the flood, people say, they're oral literature, and that's one thing, but they are clearly, I would say unquestionably, referring to something serious which happened in Mesopotamia, not the whole world. I don't believe that for a moment. And as for this Bosphorus Black Sea thing, I run away from it because I'm not in a position to judge it. All I know about is the inscriptions. And the inscriptions make it clear, in my opinion, that in Mesopotamian subconscious psychology, there was always the fear of flood. There was a fear of drought, but there was a fear of flood, and it wasn't predicated on imagination. It was predicated on some kind of thing that happened in the remote past. I mean, you could imagine that it might be 1,000 years or more before the tablets were written down, or longer, because in antiquity, in places like Mesopotamia, hardly anything happened. So when you had something really big, like a flood where houses were swept away when they're made of mud brick, it's not so difficult, and the streets disappeared and people were drowned and the animals were floating and everybody thought the end of the world had come and the gods hated them. But when you have that kind of thing at one given date, nobody forgets it for endless generations afterwards, because grandfathers tell their grandchildren and their grandchildren tell their grandchildren. You forget that when the gods are angry, they need to wipe us out, and you have to be, it's a kind of didactic matter for respect of the gods and the fearfulness of not having water. And it's very remarkable that there are some indications that the damming of water might have been a kind of immoral war process at certain times in Mesopotamian history, just as it is sometimes in the modern world. And I think that the force of the creative writing about it is such that it's very easy to believe that it comes out of a long cherished fear, bogeyman kind of thing about when the flood came and we don't want the flood to come again, sort of thing, which was at the back of people's minds. It's not something they thought every time they got up in the morning, but it's there in the joint psychology. And I think, and the story, the narrative in Gilgamesh and the earlier texts is a fantastic piece of literature, and it went lock, stock, and barrel into the Bible. And we know that it was a complete, straightforward link, because some of the vocabulary used to describe the ark in Hebrew uses words which are never otherwise found in the Hebrew languages, and they are loan words from Babylonian. So there can be no doubt. And the interesting thing to reflect on is that in the Mesopotamian philosophical view of the flood and what happened, the motive for the destruction which is attributed to the gods is the following: that the human race was regarded as as they say, too noisy. And this is an interesting matter because, as it were, you have to imagine all the gods have a good Christmas lunch and they're all in their deck chairs snoozing, and then they hear all this racket coming up from below and disturbing them like other people's, it seems to me always like other people's children on the beach, is that kind of idea. And so the gods decided in conclave that they were going to wipe out mankind and replace it with something which worked harder and made less noise. I think this was the framework in which the explanation for the destruction was couched. But as a matter of fact, we can second guess this, because in the events after the flood, one of the changes in society which was instigated by the gods was the creation of death, the creation of women who couldn't have children, of stillborn children, and all those other things was created in society, implying that beforehand there was nothing which killed them off, that they got more and more and more of them, and that the noise was actually a reflection of excessive population. So that one of the changes was to make sure that never happened. But when the Jewish philosophers in Babylon, who'd been dragged there from Jerusalem for their 70 years of existence within Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, when they encountered this story and incorporated it in the early chapters of Genesis, their idea was this: that God decided to punish the world because of sin, looked down and saw what they were up to, and it was sin. And it's very remarkable and very significant, because the Old Testament is obsessed with sin and criticism and telling people off and being a strict parent and so forth and so forth. And what happened was, what happened before and what's happened ever since, that you have a strong storyline in one context which suited that context, which could be either borrowed lock, stock and barrel, or recycled or readjusted, where the dramatic components, that's to say that you've got a week to build this boat and the world's going to be finished and God's angry with you and the gods are angry with you and you've got to get on with it and diddly diddly dig, all this kind of stuff. The same story was equally valid and powerful in two different religious or philosophical frameworks. And this is this is a thing which makes mockery of people who say that if we have the Babylonian thing 1,000 years before the Bible, does that devalue the Bible? Was God shortchanged? Wasn't there a copyright rule and all this kind of hanky-panky? It's just nonsense, because the adoption of a literary topos, a theme like that in one context, and its recycling with a new lease of life, is a commonplace. For example, it undercuts the greater proportion of English fiction, because hardly anybody can invent a new plot from scratch. It's very, very difficult to think of something. But what people do is they read a book and they like it, and then 10 years later, something of it comes into their mind and they use it in their own book. And all this is a kind of reality of creating writing. So it's partly to do with that. And therefore, I mean, the other thing that struck me when I was working on that book was if half the films that come out of Hollywood are a recycling of the flood story, because you have aliens coming and there's a really, really big, tall, strong American, and there's a clock that goes tick, 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 and you've got 4 days, 3.5 days, 3 days to build the biggest machine gun in the world to shoot them. And the kind of the time running out, one man rescuing the world, is an irresistible motif. And if you made an analysis of all the Hollywood films where that was the central theme, it would be very illuminating.
I think that a central theme for a Hollywood movie that would be fantastic would be the coracle, and the idea of building a small circular boat to float in. And this is the difference between the flood myth of Mesopotamia, which was basically a giant coracle. And to come clean, I actually knew somebody that owned a coracle. He lived on the island of South Uist, Stornoway, off the coast of Scotland, and they were still building them up there.
That's the sort of place where they still flourish, yes.
Yes, and they actually have a boat day in Stornoway, and, you know, it's all about building coracles. But these ancient boats, that is how Mesopotamia saw it. But biblically speaking, it's much, much different. So you have, in both cases, a deity saying, build it this way, but yet with the biblical part, it's build it this way, a different sort of design. How's that come about, to build two different kinds of boats for the same myth from the same origins?
Well, that's a good question. I wrote this mad book called The Ark Before Noah with a long description about how this happened, because this is the thing. In ancient Iraq, they had coracles which looked like the ones you might see in Scotland or Wales or Tibet, made from local materials, waterproofed, and they float about on the rivers. And if you're particularly skillful, you can control them. But they have a mind of their own, coracles. And if you're not careful, if the coracle gets cross with you, it decides to go round and round and round and round. So the coracle itself seems to have a mind of its own. I've been in them. But the thing is, which is so interesting, is that in the flood story, which from about 1800, the earliest version of it, the gods prescribe building a round boat with all the materials and the measurements to the Noah, who's woken up from a peaceful night's sleep and told he's the one who has to rescue mankind and get on with it. So they tell him about the materials and the size of it, and it's a gigantic coracle, which is modelled on the normal one where you cross the river with your mother-in-law and a couple of sheep, and to something where all the animals, so to speak, could go in when the waters came to be rescued and carry on afterwards. And of course, everyone says, well, how could you get them all in? And they're so heavy, and the elephants would sit on the grasshoppers and all that. But actually, when I was writing this book, I try to write about it sympathetically with the Babylonian narrative. That's to say, not poo-pooing it and saying, oh, yeah, very funny and all that, but to actually reading their words, trying to be in the narrative as it might have unraveled. And one of the interesting things is this, which you don't think of when all the animals and birds go in the ark, two of each, is that, of course, they meant all the ones they knew. So if you live in Iraq, you don't know all the animals which David Attenborough on his 99th birthday in 2 days would be able to tell you off the top of his head that populate the world, that would be impossible. All they knew was the fish that are in their rivers, and the things that they see in the forests when they go hunting, and the things that they live in the field. The idea that they rescued all the livestock from their world in a giant coracle for the future is not, as it were, incredible. The other one is an incredible thing, but when you look at it like that, it changes its tone. And they picked a coracle because the thing about coracles, as you already indicated, is they don't sink. That they might tip you out, but you can't sink a coracle. And what they wanted was a floating lifeboat where everybody could sit there and wait until the waters went down, and then pile out the door and start breeding like billio. So it didn't have to go anywhere; it just had to float. So this is the thing. Now, in the tablet which describes the instructions from one of the gods to this Noah fellow, he tells him not only about what he has, he says you have to make it circular, so that how does he put it? That it's equal, the sides are of equal length, and it's rather difficult to imagine a circle with sides of equal length, but this is how it works. If you draw a circle inside a box that touches the extremities of the curve in 4 places, then you can see how a circle can be said to have the same width and the same length, but before you have the conception of a radius. And so in schools where they did geometry, there are some tablets, cuneiform tablets, with exercises on and with geometrical shapes which the pupils had to work out the area and things of this kind. And one of them is a perfectly drawn circle inside a square where you can see the conception where it could be said to be the same length and breadth. And what happened is that the story, as it evolved down through the ages, the squareness of it, the length and breadth of it, description suppressed the curvy bit, which was lost sight of. And so that's how you end up eventually. It's a long and complicated matter of philology, but you end up in the Bible with a square-sided ark, which in fact is like a coffin shaped. It's an oblong and the most unboat-like looking thing you could ever imagine. And I don't know what would happen if you tried to use it, but it's possible to demonstrate that in the Bible, the description of that, which came out of the last version in cuneiform, represents a misunderstanding of what originally was meant to be the clearest way of explaining that it was a circle. It's rather ironic. So I think that you have textual heritage running side by side with ideas, and that seems to me the only conclusion that makes sense of it. But I don't know. But the other point which you indicated before about the flood stories all over the place is that I regard there's no question that the Judeo-Christian Muslim tradition of Nuh, the Noah, and the Noach in the Bible, and the one which the Christians took from the Jewish tradition, come from Mesopotamia in a complete, indisputable, direct line. So that's that. But it doesn't mean at all that all other flood stories which you can find, some are rather similar, some drastically different, some are kind of compromised, which have been documented by people in many different parts of the world in different periods, it does not mean for a moment that they all derive from this narrative, because flooding and rivers and boats are where people live in the world, and there's that. But then you have this. You might postulate that because of the frailty of human life, because of their vulnerability to water when they live by riversides, are all population that sometime or another experience flooding, and all of them know about boats. And so they all had this kind of stuff in their makeup, and that's why they have stories about it. But there's a complication on top, because of missionaries, because missionaries went out all over the world to preach the holy word, and one of the ways they did it was to tell children Bible stories, and I think it's quite likely that descriptions of the flood and the ark and the animals and Noah and Mrs. Noah and all the little Noahs was a very effective way of captivating a room full of 7-year-olds wherever it might be, and transplanting the neo version of the Babylonian material into completely different parts of the world in this kind of fashion. So if one were to try and, which I would never do, take flood myths as a literary theme and try to distinguish strands within it and where it appears and the meaning of it and whether it's punishment or whether it's to do with enlightenment. I don't know what. I don't know what it would tell you, or it would confirm me, in my mind, that these sorts of matters are essentially human and miraculous in their way. They're flags of human experience, and it's not always necessary to say that this derives from this and this turned into that. Because it's such a big thing, and the span of time is so huge that I don't think it's a really serious point. But I do feel that the flood story, which everybody in Europe knows and the main 3 monolithic religions of the world know, is a direct inheritance from the Babylonian tradition.
Now, in regards to actually take a broader perspective here, the idea of how the Babylonians saw their world, and they left us a very, very famous artifact showing their worldview and how they viewed the world, which obviously they didn't have the benefit of going to space and seeing how it really was. But tell us about that.
As far as we know, just a moment. We mustn't say that because some of your viewers will say, well, actually, that's not true. I've seen one of these spaceships, so you have to be careful. But as far as we know. Yeah.
Well, I actually haven't even... I believe, personally, if we're going to throw out hypotheses, that had the Roman Empire seized upon Heron of Alexandria's steam engine, we would have been on the moon in the 5th century.
And by now, the moon would be covered in pollution.
Yes, Pepsi bottles.
And dysfunctional and probably dying. We'd have to have television programs saying the moon's only got another 500 years to live, and then we've screwed up another planet in the world. So I don't know. But you may be right. It's a pity that Alexander died young, but he was one of those people who really had no alternative, I think.
Yeah, he probably didn't, but he didn't die so young.
Well, he died pretty young.
30
considering
something?
How old some worthless people managed to be, it's a pity that he died when he did. He could have done a lot more good.
Now, in regards to the Babylonian world map now how did they see the world in their imagination? And, within the confines of Mesopotamia, they didn't know, like with the animals, they didn't know the wild turkey existed in North America because they didn't know North America existed. But what encapsulates their worldview on how they view the planet from their perspective? And this changes because by the 16th century in Europe, you see medals being struck that actually show their projection of the Earth, and it's much more accurate. But in ancient times, they didn't have a lot to go on. So what was their conception of the world?
Well, the way they did it, you can say it's a stylized conception. The first thing is that the world in which they lived, which they operated, was circular. It's a disk. And the round world within which the rivers and the cities of Mesopotamia and the tribes who live there and all the Mesopotamian heartland is shown, it's drawn on the map, city names and so forth. It's surrounded by a ring of water all the way round, which they call the Maratu. And Maratu is sometimes a word for sea, and sometimes it's a word for, in this case, it's a bitter river. It's probably a river of salt water, in other words. So they had the idea that they lived on a round terrain, a circular terrain. All round it there was this ring of bitter water, and beyond that there was a landscape where there were, as it's shown on the map, 8 triangles pointing out in all the different directions like the points on a compass, 8 of them. And these are, in some respects, either remote geographical areas or possibly cosmic areas beyond that waterway. And it's very remarkable that the drawing, the drawing has been taken by some people. It's complicated, this. Some people think that the world is flat. And when this map comes to their attention, they're absolutely delighted, because there you can see the world is a round, flat thing. And so they're very triumphant. But in fact, it's not the case, because we think that they understood that the world was a globe, was a ball, by different things, but one of them is when you see an eclipse and the shadow of the earth is a different shaped curve and that sort of thing. And people in antiquity, they weren't like gorillas picking their noses and grunting. They were populations from Mesopotamia, certainly in the time this tablet was written, which is about the 7th century BC. They represented a complete parallel to modern life, in that you'd have people who were thieves and rogues and adulterers and murderers at one end, and you'd have people who were saintly and intellectually brilliant and thoughtful and helpful, and all the other people in the middle. And you have the same spread of ability, the same spread of intelligence, and the same rarity of really bright intelligence. But the thing is, we have to reckon that people in Mesopotamia observed a very great deal about the world in which they lived, partly because they had, the ones who were really clever, had very inquiring and curious minds, and partly because it's easy to forget, something which is so significant, that there was no pollution. So if you, in 1800 BC, slept on the roof because it was so hot, which I'm sure people did, you lay back in your old Babylonian hammock after a good meal, next to the wife by your side with your hands behind your head, and looked up at the sky, and what you would have is a drive-in movie, because there were no lights, no neon, no smoke, no pollution, no nothing. So the whole of the thing above your head would be laid out like a drive-in movie. So this is a very significant matter, because it meant that everybody knew more about the night sky than people do today. Most people know nothing about it whatsoever, or astronomy or anything like that. They just say, oh, I don't understand it. But the people who lived there, they had no choice, because it was over them. And that's why the gods were so important. And that's why they thought all the stuff, their religious belief and everything is mixed up in this fact that it was all there above their heads. And so this is the situation as I see it. You have people who snore and never take any notice, but you have someone who lies there thinking, it's a funny thing. I'm sure the other week it wasn't there, it was over there. I'm sure that you only have to have a single person who says this to themselves, and then they make a little mark somewhere, and then they discover it's moved even further. And then once you have that light bulb, the whole of astronomy will develop, because there will be people who, once this is drawn to their attention, or they thought it for themselves, they'll want to know why, they want to know what it means, they want to know how it works. And they understood a fantastic amount in the end, how it works. They knew how to predict eclipses, dates, that sort of stuff. They did serious astronomy, which would make quite a few of the Greeks sit up, not just astrology, but also astronomy. So I believe that the starting point for the study of the heavens and the observation of things was Fort Demure, because there was nothing else to see. And it's not that someone built a telescope and thought, I wonder whether. I really believe in the principle that most discoveries are by accident, and the intelligence is to observe when something happens which has an implication. That is the essence of human intelligence. And the thing deciding, I wonder what would happen if I did this, I wonder how we can do that, is a secondary development, because the first is rigidly accurate and the second is experimental. So I think that's how I see it. And this Fort de Meaux, the Milky Way, and then everything moves except the pole star, which doesn't. So then you have the situation that how can one of them be fixed and the others move, and then sometimes they don't come for a long time, and people start to keep astronomical records, and before you know where you are, you're sitting on a gold mine of really intellectually scientific collected information of the primary type. So why we started talking about this, I've forgotten. What was the original point?
Oh, the Babylonian worldview and how they saw.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So what do we do with the Babylonian map? Because it's got stuff on it which is old and some stuff which is newer. But I think they believed about these districts which came off in different directions, that to some extent they were far-flung parts of the world. They weren't necessarily fully in cosmos, beyond the reach of human beings, because they describe animals on them. And I've been working on it recently, and one of the animals I think is a rhinoceros. So it's an ox with one horn. So that's not something up in outer space. That is a real animal, and there were rhinoceroses in, of course, Africa, and there were rhinoceroses in India, and so forth. So it looks like that you have a combination, as I see it, of a certain amount of astronomical theory, coupled with a certain amount of narrative reported by people who travel to foreign parts. Because we were talking before about fearless people who went out in a really early age from one country to another to travel, to look there, to have their adventure, or to become rich, to do this, that, and the other. The wander kind of idea, a basic human thing, probably goes back for a very long way. So you have this people who go to a country where they see animals you've never seen before, and sometimes they never came home, and sometimes they did. And you end up in the pub in Babylon. You say, well, I saw this. It looked like an ox when I saw it, and turned around. It only had one big horn. I thought, what the hell is this? And so he pouring beer down his throat. All his mates said, well, tell us more about it. How big was it? And by the time of the evening, it would be twice as big as the thing he saw, maybe 3 times as big as the thing he saw, and even rarer. And then it had jewels for eyes and God knows what. So you have the process of travelers' experience and tales being exponentially developed. But some of the material looks like it is based on this kind of experience. For example, my friend Andrew George wrote a marvelous book about Gilgamesh and translated all the stories of Gilgamesh. And then another tablet came up afterwards, after the book was done, which is a new bit of text in which a jungle was described in the Babylonian. And this was about 1800 BC, 1700 BC. It was a jungle, and the noise and the monkeys and the heat. And nobody invented that. Nobody invented that. There are no jungles in Iraq. So somebody must have got probably all the way to India and stayed there and found out and went on all these adventures. And when he came back, this was incorporated into the story as if you go far enough over there, that's the sort of thing that happens to you. And I think the map is a bit like that. And anyway, I'm working on it with my friend Mark Wilson, and we are writing a book with whatever we can discover about it. I've had a good go at rereading the cuneiform, and new bits have come out, so it'd be quite an interesting thing. But the map was done in the 7th century, and one of the interesting things about it is this, that the double ring, the ring of water around it, looks like the letter O. And in the map, you have a thing which is the Euphrates River, which goes down the middle of the circle, with the Persian Gulf at the bottom. So it looks a bit like the letter T upside down. Now this is very significant, because the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, had maps of the world. So they were round, and they were surrounded by a sea, and they obviously are directly based on the Babylonian forerunner. They incorporated the design and then they adapted it to their knowledge of the world, and gradually it evolved. But even down into the medieval period, there were maps that had this circle with this T in it, which they do upside down. So cartographers for many years have referred to the tradition of the T and O maps, which is a very healthy and well-documented field, for a long time unaware of the fact that actually the T is the upside-down Euphrates River, and in the transition it followed this principle. So it's hilarious, and it's actually rather heartwarming, and there's another interesting lesson to be learned from it, because we only have one map of the world. And in Mesopotamian studies, I think like elsewhere in the world, when you only have one, there is a kind of uninhibited glee about the conclusion that it must be unique. And this is the most foolish precept you can ever imagine, because if you only have one thing, it means you only have one of them, and it doesn't in any way mean that it was ever unique in its own time. And the fact that the Greeks copied this design and it persisted in scholarly circles among monks and I don't know who, into medieval France, they have them even into the 16th, 17th century, this kind of T&O thing, shows that when the Greeks were in Babylonia, they must have encountered this map in many ways. It's not they saw the one which ended up in the British Museum and made a photocopy of it. Not at all. They must have seen so many of them that the idea was imprinted in their minds, so that when they went home to Greece, they started off with this. They didn't put Babylon in it. They put their own names and what have you. So it shows that the principle that the thing which only exists in one copy to us must be unique, and people whisper about it and they wear gloves and everything, but it's fatuous. It's fatuous. And it's the same thing as the sea in the dark with points of light. It's all we ever have is these remarkable, sometimes jewel-like points of light, which are on their own, but they actually stand for hundreds of related phenomena which we can't see. This is really a significant matter because it colours one's entire appreciation of antiquity and archaeological discovery, because it's all predicated on fortuity. All of it is predicated on fortuity. And it's something, if I was a university teacher, I would smack heads of anybody who ever said anything which showed they'd forgotten it. It's very, very important.
You know, there is a certain shame to this, and you mentioned pollution in the night sky. Now, with travelers, if they were going south and they were looking at the night sky, they might have noticed that there are stars rising above the horizon.
Yes.
The more you go south,
Yes.
and they would see, I can't see that from home.
Yes. So what would you
and
conclude?
they might work out.
You would conclude that the Earth was round.
I'm on a sphere. Yeah, I would conclude that I'm on a sphere.
You would, because if you've seen the eclipse with a curve and you put it together. And another thing is, if you come back to Iraq by boat from India and you come into the shore and you first see the ziggurat and then you see, like Manhattan, and then it goes, you can see that you're going over a very gradual. And the thing is, people say, well, how do you know they understood that? Because they had brains. And because they looked and because they thought. And, the engineers who worked for Nebuchadnezzar, when they built the ziggurat and they managed to irrigate a garden up in the air with pumps and God knows where, if there was a problem, they thought it out, and they had complex mathematics that they could calculate huge numbers and all this. So they had, like what's that brilliant guy who... American who worked on the bomb, who's always teaching mathematics on YouTube. He's so clever. He's gone out of my head. And doesn't matter. But the sort of people who win Nobel Prizes on merit and by discovery, they had their counterparts in antiquity. This is the point.
Well, just because somebody lives at a previous time doesn't mean they aren't just as human as we are.
I think so, but people like to think this, as I've often remarked, that the Victorians were obsessed with sex and the Romans were obsessed with underground heating, and then you have woad, and then you have gorillas living in the trees. That's the kind of process, and people think that we're much more intelligent than they were. Politicians think we're much more intelligent than anybody in the past. Big mistake. Big mistake.
Very big mistake. Which, to get where I was going, it's sort of sad with the pollution. And this is where we make a mistake, because if you go out, I live in an urban area, you go out, you're going to see 5 stars. You're not going to see the Milky Way. You're going to see Jupiter. You'll see the planets, or some of them anyway, and you'll see a few stars, but that's it. And it gets worse and worse. In the course of my lifetime as an amateur astronomer, I've seen the sky globe just get orders of magnitude worse as time went on over the last 40 years. And
I know, it's a tragic thing.
It's a tragic thing, because that is a human birthright, to be able to look at the night sky, because that goes back all the way to the cave painters in France. They were sitting around the fire at the mouth of the cave, looking up and wondering, what is that? And then they see the occasional meteor flash overhead, and they're like, what is that? And it's hard to do now.
That's how you get gods. That's how you get gods. They must be gods. And in Babylonia, the idea eventually crystallized in the principle that what happens in heaven is mirrored on the earth. They're interwoven, and astrology is part of that mechanism, and so forth. It's very fascinating. Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, sometimes I've been in the desert where sometimes, if you're lucky, you get some idea of what's there. But in Birmingham or somewhere, and Manchester and London, people say, "Where's the Milky Way? Where is it?" No, it's over there. Where? And it's you're right. It's a tragic thing. But, I don't know what will happen, but nevertheless, you have to persevere. Very important.
Well, at least we have telescopes. But that's no substitute.
But, there's something interesting about telescopes. I don't know what the official theory is, but they used to do all their astronomical, serious part of their astronomical work on the first and last visibilities of things at horizon. And there are records that go back for centuries of first and last visibilities of stars and what have you. And the constellation, it was very carefully observed. And the horizon, sometimes it's as clear as day, and sometimes, of course, it isn't. And it struck me that when you're a kid, when you want to see something, which is difficult, you make a telescope with your hand, not because you're imitating a telescope, but because delineating the area which the eye concentrates on and removing the outside stuff gives you an extra kind of clarity. So the good illustration of this is if you have a toilet roll, when the paper has all been utilized, that is in many ways a proto-telescope. Because if you look at the night sky through one of those things, your eye eventually, you know what I mean? And I think that the telescope with lenses is simply the grown-up version of the instinctive process. So I imagine that the astronomers in Babylon had hollow tubes so that they could focus on the horizon and say now, and as opposed to go, because we don't know what their eyesight was like. We've no idea about all that. And one thing we do suspect is, about the cylinder seals, which the Babylonians had. They're made of hard stone, and they're carved with stuff in reverse, the name of the owner, and sometimes all sorts of symbols, sometimes very delicate things, in very hard stone. So you have one of these, and when you're getting a mortgage from your bank manager, and it has to be witnessed by your uncle, you roll it across the tablet to ratify the agreement. So these cylinder seals are very interesting because sometimes they have detail which one cannot see without a lens. I mean, my eyes are not what they were, but before one couldn't do it. And it's been suggested that seal cutters, people went into that when they were myopic. And it's quite interesting because myopia is genetically transmitted. So you might have a family of seal cutters who got worse and worse, worse and worse, and closer, who did this very close work. Otherwise, the only way to understand how they did the carving of these details is they did it without looking. And you can do that if you imagine, I think so, if you imagine how a touch typist does everything without looking at the keyboard, that when you're very familiar with the material, that the touch is enough. And it might be if you've done a goddess and you have to do all the little rosettes on her dress, tiny scale, that you could do it by feel rather than, I don't know. It's a very interesting thing, but somebody once came up with the idea of this inherited myopia for seal cutters, and it's now become a kind of dogma in Mesopotamian studies because it's such a satisfactory explanation for how they did these terribly small things. But it's an interesting question.
Absolutely. Now, to move to another one of your projects, something more active currently, is the idea of collecting up diaries and preserving the words of the common people over the last few centuries since diaries began. But I want to ask, before we go into that, what is the closest thing you've seen in cuneiform to someone's diary speaking about an experience they had?
Well, recording of personal experience hardly ever happens. Hardly ever. Writing a novel, writing poetry, writing personal stuff, we don't have anything. We have structured texts which are sometimes called astronomical diaries, and these are large texts which go through the year, day, month, and what was visible, and the things in the heavens, and then the price of things in the market and what happened, and somebody tried to kill the king and all that. So they document history in a kind of diary form, but it's an official matter, very useful for us, but not in any way analogous to what we would call a diary. So I think that there are some Latin sources which are more like a modern diary, but you don't get I literature, so to speak, me and my life literature. Very, very unusual. Sometimes kings write their inscriptions in the first person, but they're usually to say that I was very successful in battle and killed all the enemy, thanks to Inanna, who always looks after me and always goes with me, and that kind of proclamation in the first person, but not anything that's analogous to what we would call a diary. And the thing about diaries is everybody in our world knows what you mean by a diary. It's a kind of established matter. And of course, there are lots of different sorts. But the thing is, with the relentless march of the digital world, and the relentless march of the inability to write with a pen or pencil, and all the other changes which have come about in our society, almost unnoticed, but nevertheless overpowering, I think the age of somebody writing with a small thing in a small book, their diary, is almost over. And this has come about over the period of time that the Great Diary Project has really been running. Because when I had the first idea, which was about 25 years ago, no one had any suspicion that this might be the case. And my idea was this, that everybody knows that the diaries of famous people are safe from destruction, and most of them sell them anyway when they get old to the newspapers and make a lot of money. We're not interested in all that. We're not interested in any politician's diary whatsoever. Only in the diaries of what you might call normal people, or real people, or everybody else. I don't know what the right term is. But up until fairly recently, diary keeping has been embedded in society in Britain and in America to a more or less comparable level. But now I'm not so sure how it will happen, because taking recourse to sitting on the stairs in your dressing gown with your little notebook and writing what happened in the course of the day in fervid script is something that you can hardly imagine happening much in a world where people don't do any writing at all from one month to the next. I sometimes go to literary festivals, and if you're lucky at literary festivals, they have a pile of books on a table and people come up and they want to buy one. There's nothing like selling a book to a person. And you have to, if they want, write something in the front as a dedication. And so I have a fountain pen. This is my fountain pen. If I take it out of my pocket, people say, "What's that?" It's incredible. What's that? They've never seen a fountain pen. So this bears on the question of diaries, because you can keep a diary online, you can do this, you can do that, or you can write a stupid blog, whatever you do. But the original simplicity of a private, secret little book where you write about what you want to write about and nobody else reads it may not survive to the extent to which it's prevailed before. So I decided, it was my idea by accident, it came about, that we should try. Let's see, I started out collecting diaries because I'm a curator, but then I realized that it's rescue, not collecting, which is important. So there's a library in Britain called the Bishopsgate Institute, and the archivist there, the lady Polly North, who's the librarian, they're tremendously keen about it, and they took over the hosting of this collection. So we tried to do what we could to rescue diaries which people didn't want, which they were going to probably throw away or put in the loft or something, for the long-term future. Because I think they're like cuneiform tablets, because you can have one diary or one tablet, or you can have 75 diaries or an archive of tablets. And when you have these things, you can screw them out like a sponge and all sorts of stuff comes out. So the work, in a sense, is comparable. So we have diaries from a few from the 18th century, a lot from the 19th century, a lot from the 20th century, and now some examples from the 21st century. And we accept anything which is diary-like or a diary. And a lot of people, my idea was that so that people didn't throw them away, I thought first we'd get an old lighthouse and we'd throw them in the lighthouse for the future, because they're marvellous. They're marvellous. And people think, they're all the same, so what? They go shopping, or they got flu, or they mow the lawn, or who cares? But actually, it's nothing like that at all. And we have about 22,000 diaries have come now. So this is a serious amount of material. And some of them are isolated single volumes, and some of them are a whole lifetime, one of 75 volumes. And a human being, a sentient, educated person, keeps a diary about what happens to them every day for 75 years or 65 years. This is not a rubbishy thing, because it's a kind of testimony which you cannot find anywhere else. You just can't. And though they're meant to be private, in fact, it actually works out that people don't read other people's diaries on the whole, and they are a kind of private thing. So it's a resource for the long term, because I grew up and then started in the British Museum, where the horizon is the unborn child, and the unborn child beyond them, and the human race stretching into the future, and we preserve what's important for that long, long distant day in the light. And that used to be our normal operating procedure. Now, if you say things like that, people look at you askance, as if you're wasting your time, and that's, it's not going to happen. So anyway, we're undeterred. But the quantity which has come now adds up to quite a serious statement. I don't know, there's no other library which has made a diary collection of comparable size, or even with the same idea, because we don't reject anything. And we don't criticize anything, we just take it, look after it. So some of it's quite disturbing, some of it's quite sexual, some of it's quite this, quite that. And we have an arrangement where the librarian uses a kind of judicious appraisal for how things should be handled. If people want things to be private for a long time, we arrange that. And the wonderful thing about it was, my idea was to prevent them from being destroyed. But in this library, which is a proper library, and people can come and consult them. So on the website, there's a sort of description. of what's of the light. Polly's done a huge amount of work. I mean, you can't summarize 20 volumes of diaries, but you can say it covers these years. It's a big family, have their first motor car, they go on holiday. One of them becomes a mass murderer, the usual kind of everyday story of country folk. And she puts on a summary like that, and then people who are looking for things, especially from America, who try to track down their old family, come and look at these diaries. So already they have a kind of historical appreciation. They're being utilized. So I'm always asking people about it, spreading the word. There ought to be something comparable in America. It's very difficult in America because you couldn't have an American diary repository because it's all states. I mean, I've talked about it to quite a lot of people, but the Americans are diary keepers. This is the point. And it would be tragic, really, if I mean, they get thrown away in the most merciless fashion because either people can't read them, or they're smelly, or they're dusty, or they've got spiders in, or they're scared what they say. Like, God, there might be maybe it's not my auntie at all, and all this kind of rubbish. So there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction when you find old diaries in a family. You get rid of them fast before anybody reads them. So we've tried to do something to interrupt that natural process. And the same should be done in America. I have quite a lot of American diaries. It's interesting, there's much more religion in them than there is in England. It's perceptible matter. But nevertheless, it would be good in countries where diary keeping is so important. And of course, it bumps into literature because you have diaries in novels, and they're part of the written intellectual life, but they're quite different from everything else. They're marvelous, I think. They're very, very fascinating. I've come to the conclusion that with cuneiform tablets, even if they're very small and only have a small amount of information on, there's always something in a tablet which is really interesting. And the same is with the diary. It's the same with the diary. People might riffle through it and say, look, well, who cares? Who cares? But actually, when you read it, you suddenly step over a threshold into a life. Even if it's sparsely described, sometimes an expression is terrifically evocative and of the moment and of a period. And they're just fantastic. And to think that they'll be saved for the future, as long as diaries are written, we'll continue to accept them. And then one day it will be a finished thing. But I've often thought, if we have 22,000 diaries, imagine if we had 10,000 diaries from the time of Shakespeare. I mean, imagine what a resource it would be. And the thing, like we were talking before, how the world evolves, that for most of its time, nothing happened. For millennia, nothing happened. And like people who have a happy childhood can't remember much about their childhood. And the world has often been like that. Generations and generations of farmers in the same place. There's no sort of stuff. But what happens now is the evolution of everything gets faster and faster and faster. And this is terrifying because it means no one can keep track with it. And there's no way to measure it. People who are from Dunkirk, who are having tea with the king, who went through all that experience. It must, for those people who are still in a position to think like this, they might be sitting in a deck chair thinking, I cannot believe what's happened since then in my life, what's happened in the world. And the evolution of things, and it's not by any means all for the good, not by any means, but the disjunct between moral and legal and human evolution of ideas and the commercial invention, money-making science is almost complete. And it's a tragic thing. It's a tragic thing because the human race is such a phenomenal thing. It has so much to offer. And there's a parallel between the human brain and a computer in this revealing respect, that if you buy a laptop for £1,000, you take it home and it's a jolly good word processor, and you can do your emails and you can do drawings and you can do this. But in point of fact, nobody ever uses a laptop for a fraction of what you could do with it. A fraction of what you could do. They don't. It's just as bad. They don't even know what you could do with it. And it's the same with brains. It's exactly the same with brains. And the education and the treatment of students and the impoverishment of the intellectual world in which we live has the effect that all these babies that come out with their brilliant fizzy stuff, and they can learn astrophysics and they can learn German and they can ride a bicycle and they're only 2 months old, like that, all that stuff, you go to school and it's all suppressed, it's all beaten out of them. They're not meant to feel special. They're not meant to feel curious. You know, the curiosity of children is something which ought to be something that people get into Parliament on the basis of. It's so important. To put the light under it, blow like that. It's criminal. It's criminal. I have 5 children and an increasing number of grandchildren, so I know a bit about what happens at school, and I've come to the conclusion that schools in this country, and very probably university in this country, are basically child minders.
Oh, it's same in the US.
Because when you have a baby,
yeah,
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. But it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, I had a job between 1976 and 1979 in the University of Chicago in the Oriental Institute. And that place, I tell you, was run like a cancer research unit. It was dead serious. And people went out for dinner on Christmas Eve and went back to work. And on Boxing Day, there were lights on in all the rooms where the professors got back to their work. Didn't want to fritter away another moment. And it was incredible to be in an institution where everybody was like that. There were no slouches or anything, and students fell by the wayside. I mean, anybody who got a PhD out of the University of Chicago must be as resilient a human as you could possibly be. But so, you know, you must be the same with you. You must know of the time when the principles of how children should be taught and what they should be taught and how important it all is were not articulated and discussed all the time, but everybody knew really what's important. Now, people, you know, that noise, that terrible, terrible noise.
I am somewhat biased in this, in that I actually went and learned to read ancient Greek and Latin because they didn't teach it to me in school. Mm-hmm. Yet they did my grandparents' days. So I have this sort of bias. But I want to point out, firstly, for anybody interested in the Great Diary Project, there will be links. You can go down here, hit that link, and find out how to help and find out more. But also, you know, we were talking about the sadness of not being able to see the Milky Way. Well, you touched on something that resonates with me, because I remember when book fairs were common, used book fairs, and there were used bookstores everywhere. And you go and you find a 150-year-old book, and inside of it, you get it home, you find a letter somebody wrote, or you find leaves, you know, like preserved leaves from a tree, you know, things, just all sorts of things that you used to find. That joy is going away because it is very difficult.
I know that joy. I know that joy. I definitely know that joy. Exactly.
And I guess that's probably how the diaries are. When you get a diary, how often do you find one that just is such a gem that you're compelled by it, more so than any novel?
Well, that's a really pertinent question. I think the best case that I can quote is a diary came in, and this old lady came in, and she had diaries in a kind of shopping cart, and she poured them out on the table, and she said, "I've written all these, and then I'll go home, and when I've finished the others, when I'm dead, you can have the others as well," like that. And one of them was a 5-year diary, which she'd had when she must have been a teenager. So it was a fat 5-year diary with a lock. And the point about the lock was no one was supposed to look inside. And you know that thing they say in gangster movies that a blind man could open it with a limp noodle kind of thing? It's that sort of lock. You look at it and it opens. But anyway, it had blue plastic washable cover. And it was a fat thing, but what was so marvelous about it is it was stuffed with materials: bus tickets, cinema tickets, tickets for the Who, things you've seen in a magazine, things you wanted. It was just an encyclopedic moment of that girl's life, all preserved. And I thought it was $1 million object, and we have nothing like it. And this is the sort of thing that a girl goes to university or a boy goes to university and they're clearing out the kids' room and they chuck all that stuff out, that's a very great rarity. And inside the back cover, my favorite thing, there was a ruled set of columns in pencil. And that thing when you were at school, when you have your finger holding the ruler and you're doing a straight line and blast, it goes over the tip like that. So you get a little loop instead of a straight line because it projected over the edge of the ruler. If you ever do that, it's really annoying. And one of these column rulings had this loop, so I could immediately empathize because it's supposed to be neat. And it had along the top for each column the name of some boy, and then down the side marks out of 10 for kissing. And I thought, what $1 million thing. I mean, you imagine this from the time of, I don't know what, Christopher Marlowe, something like that in brown ink or something, because all the intervening ages pare away. And as long as they're going to be boys and girls and people going to the cinema and falling in love with one another and behaving like people used to do when they were kids, anybody who reads that thing in 100 years' time or 200 years' time, whatever has happened, it will be like a kind of eloquent thing. So I think it's one of our best diaries. And most people probably would have put it in the bin without hesitating. It's just fantastic. We have all sorts of things, but that to me is, if you ask for number one, I think despite all these solemn Victorian things and pater familias, and there's a lot of religious hanky-panky about I'm going to be a better person, especially on New Year's Eve. People often get swept away with that, and lots. I mean, it's all marvelous. And one of my favourite things is that there's a boy who. So one diary of this boy, and he really fancies this girl, and she appears throughout the diary, and we've only got one diary, so we never find out whether he succeeded. But I'll tell you something else about that very issue. There was a lady who came to London once. I think her husband had a job here. I'm not quite sure. And she had this idea of renting an upstairs room in a pub and getting people to come and read their diaries. So she was obviously female, and almost all of the people who did were female. So they would come and bring their teenage diaries, and everyone would sit about. And there was a chaise longue where each person read out from their diaries. And the ones written by the teenage girls, they were all marked by a certain universal prudence, that they hated everybody in the world. They hated their father and their mother and their teacher and the headmaster and the policeman. And when they read them out, all the other girls in the room, I mean, they were women really, burst out laughing as if they were very funny. I thought they were rather sad, because I had 3 sisters, and I don't remember them hating everything else in the world. But anyway, they thought this was marvelous. And then I went 3 or 4 times, and once it was this bloke, and he was very courageous, I thought. He worked in another museum. I never met him before, and he read out a diary from when he was about 15, something like that. And he sat on the edge of this thing and he read it out. And what happened was this: there was a girl he wanted. This girl he really had terribly bad desire for, unbearable. And she lived nearby, and sometimes she would be at the bus stop and sometimes not. And when he went towards the bus stop, till he got there, didn't know whether she'd been, and he could never make up his mind whether he wanted her to be there or whether he'd prefer if she wasn't there, because it was so unsettling. Because when he saw it, he had to hold on to the lampposts in anguish. And he'd written it as it happened in his own words, and he read it, not souping it up. He just read it, and I know exactly what any person would. But it was so affecting to me. I felt so much. I understood, and all those horrible women with their lipstick and I don't know what, they were all laughing as if it was a funny thing, but boy, it wasn't funny, because when you're in that position at that kind of age, it is a life and death matter. And I was very glad that he'd survived, because he talked about sitting on the bus and somewhere at the back, he didn't want to turn around, but he had to turn, and all that kind of stuff like that. It's trite and obvious, and if you're a robot, probably stupid. But I thought it was hugely affecting. In fact, I thought all the teenage diaries were very affecting, and none of them was funny. I thought they were all very revealing. But that boy describing that thing, marvelous, very marvelous. I don't know what happened to that diary. I don't know what his name is, because it ought to be in our collection, really.
We need to have a project called Keep a Diary Project to keep the writing tradition of diaries going.
Well, I don't know.
Age. I mean, maybe you could use the laptop for that. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, two thoughts. One is that I think diary keeping, as it was traditionally, is dying a death. I think its function is different. It's of a different age. Its function, its preoccupation, its justification, its value belong in a different age, I think. But the other thing is, once you put something on a computer, a laptop, you can get a program Wednesday, January the 1st, Thursday, January the 2nd, and all that. And every day you can sit there and type. But there are all sorts of things about that which to me are flatly impossible. The first one is this, that when people write diaries privately, they forget all about spelling, because nobody goes over their shoulder and says, you don't spell receive like that, don't you remember? And sometimes they might spell receive 3 ways differently on the same page, because no one is reading it and nobody's there to tell them off. So there's a kind of liberty. That's important. You try doing that on a computer, and the computer goes red, and you have to spell check. Do you mean this? All that kind of thing. So you couldn't write with freedom on a computer, because it will be constantly interfering with you. This is one thing. The second thing is that people often write this in a diary: got up, had breakfast, went to work, came home, had dinner, watched some television, went to bed, for example. I don't know, there must be thousands and thousands of diary pages like that. And sometimes in a diary, you have this motif repeated quite a lot. Because when people keep a diary when they're a kid, the first thing they say to their mum is, what am I supposed to do with this book? And the mum says, well, just say what happened. And so that's what people do. And if they're not driven and persecuted and full of poetry, they record what happens like they've been told to. So they do that. Got up, had breakfast, went to work, all that. I think this is how that works. Because once you do it, you don't think. Now, the thing is, it's perfectly acceptable in a small diary to write that, say, out of 52 weeks, 46 weeks. But you can't do it on a computer. You just can't do it. Because if you do, you think, what the hell am I doing? You just can't do it. And so what happens is this, I believe, you go through an evolution of thinking, which is the following. Well, look, I said in my normal thing, I got up. Well, look, I tell you what we'll do is, if I don't get up, I'll say so. Otherwise, we'll read it for granted. And then what the demands of the computer and the reality of the computer will make the normal, spontaneous, private, ejaculate kind of function of diary writing impossible. And then on top of it, everybody in the world loses things on computers. Everybody does. And in my opinion, the whole gamut will all perish. It is the most perishable thing ever invented. Whereas if you have a little book written in pencil on paper, as long as it isn't chucked in the sea or set on fire with petrol, will last forever. So this is a very practical matter. You cannot write the same thing day after day on a computer. You can't, because what you'll do is copy and paste, and copy and pasting is death to diary keeping. So I just don't believe it's possible. I think if you had a very strong personality and a very different vision of a diary, it's possible. But then, of course, you stray into that terrible morass or confusion, the blog, because hundreds of people have said to me, "Well, isn't the blog the modern equivalent of old-fashioned diary keeping?" And then I usually throw something at them, because this is the truth. When you write a diary, you don't really want anybody in the universe to read it. And therefore, you write the truth as you see it. If you write a blog, you want as many people as possible in the universe to read it. And it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. So they are the opposite ends of a possibly similar looking activity.
Now, another thing that, listen to me, I'm sitting here lamenting the whole interview. I've been lamenting the loss of the night sky and the loss of diaries, but also,
I agree with you.
Also, quality of writing. If you remember, and I'm sure you look at early diaries, if you have a diary from 1810, the penmanship is going to be amazing more often than not. And then it just degrades and you lose. We've basically lost cursive writing at this point. I don't think it's even taught in the schools anymore, whereas it was very forcefully taught to me by nuns in Catholic school when I was growing up. But now it's almost gone. And we're losing the ability of human writing in this way. But here's a question from left field. Does that happen in ancient writing? In other words, is there a high form of cuneiform that degrades over time? And we know that, Egyptian, you start with the pictographic hieroglyphs, and it just sort of goes into this hieratic, and then it gets replaced with Greek, and things like that. Do you see that?
And also Demotic. Don't forget Demotic.
Yeah. And
Demotic looks like nothing on earth unless you're a proper Egyptologist. It's true. The question is whether this is degeneration or evolution. I'm not sure, because the process from hieroglyphic to hieratic to demotic is a kind of streamlining plus abbreviation plus minimalizing. It's not decrepit, it's not deformed or weakened or something. It's an evolving graphic technique, I think. I'm not quite sure that that's an analogous thing, because we have, for example, tablets written by first-rate scribes, like the ones who worked for the king of Assyria were top-notch scribes. They never made mistakes. They had the most beautiful calligraphy. And people who wrote business documents and letters, sometimes they're pretty schlocky, and you think, what school did this guy go to? There's that phenomenon. And also, but if you have a cuneiform tablet from the Seleucid period, time of Alexander and later, then the wedges lean backwards and they're at such an angle that it's much more difficult to tell one wedge from another, one sign from another, unless you're experienced. But it's not the same as decay. It's a kind of, because in the same way, in an analogous fashion, the language evolves, because the old standard Babylonian form of Hammurabi of Babylon, 18th century, had grammatical endings which gradually fall off, and probably people at the time of Nebuchadnezzar lamented the way people speak nowadays because they don't put the grammatical endings on and all that kind of thing. But they're unstoppable matters, and the same with all languages. I mean, everybody thinks that English is worse than when they were a boy, but of course now it jolly well is worse than when you're a boy, that we know. But I think also the case of America is rather peculiar, because you can recognize American writing from a single word, because at a certain period, many Americans had the same handwriting. This doesn't apply in England, nowhere near, because people who learned to write at school, you had to do loops that were parallel and descenders that were the same length like that. But most people broke away from the rigor of the writing to develop their own sort of script. I think that's a very common principle, because you don't see, I mean, my mum, for example, my mother was a teacher, and when she went to teacher training college, they taught her you have to have very clear writing when to write reports and on people's work. And so she wrote always in the most legible handwriting. It was astonishing when you saw it, because most people's handwriting is not very legible. So that's a bit like the American system. What did you say it was called, that what they taught you? The nuns, that kind
cursive writing, which honestly was sort of a copy of quasi-Arabic, but it was the very old school cursive writing. That's what we call it. It may be different in Britain, though.
It is different in Britain, but I got a lot of American diaries, and ones of a certain period, you'd be hard put to differentiate one page by a writer from another page, because they'd obviously learnt the proportions, and they'd been taught, and they'd done it that way ever since. It's rather delightful thought, really, that the teacher, now this is how you do it, you've got to learn this properly. And then for the 80 years old, they still do the same kind of writing, the distance above the line and below the line, as they were taught. That went all over the place in Britain. You wouldn't be able to recognize English handwriting probably as a generic thing like American handwriting. And also with letters, it's true. It's very interesting. All of it's interesting.
Well, you're right in that it was very standardized. There were rules on writing this way, and I was taught them. But I'm one of the last. I'm pushing 50, put it that way, and I'm one of the last. That was from that generation that was taught that. It is not taught at all today, to my knowledge, unless it's a specialty school or something like that. But it's a dying art, and it's a shame, because the writing is actually rather beautiful, I think. You see that 19th century cursive writing where people were taking the time, and writing letters, taking the time and sending somebody a 5-page letter. Yeah. And it's gone.
I know. Yeah, I know. I quite agree. But also, a lot of people find that if you have a good paper and a good fountain pen, that it's a tremendous spur to creativity. If you're writing a novel or poetry, to write poetry on a computer screen is very difficult for me. And also, I've written some fiction, and what I used to do is write. I had lots of little notebooks. I wrote everything longhand, and then when I got it right, I typed it up on the computer. It was a long time before I could use the keyboard for creative writing, because I was brought up, because there's pleasure in writing also. And when you get into a letter, you can reach page 5 without looking up, can't you? Because you get into the flow of it, sort of idea. It'll be interesting to collect letters. I'm sure there are people who do collect letters, but the problem about that as a proposal is that it's only seldom that you get both sides of a correspondence. So as a resource, letters are kind of they're cut off, really, in comparison with the diaries, where that question doesn't apply.
So my background, I've written 2 science fiction novels, and that's how I ended up on YouTube, was trying to basically promote my science fiction novels. And then I ended up being a talk show host somehow. But my writing process, the very famous author Stephen King extols the virtues of using a fountain pen and writing with a fountain pen. I use old school pencils.
Oh.
And I write everything in old school pencil because I can erase it. Let me ask you this. Yeah. Do you keep a diary? No. Diary of a curator of the British Museum. And if you did, would you do it in fountain pen?
Yes, I would do it in fountain pen, but I've never kept a diary. It's interesting that with diaries, they usually come with a pencil in a little sheath down the spine. And in fact, I think it's probably true that a minority of diaries after a certain period are written in pencil because of this. If you write fervently with a pencil, it becomes blunt after about 2 lines. And then you have the business of sharpening a diary pencil, which is not so straightforward. I collect diary pencils because they're so diagnostic. And some of my favourite ones have obviously been cut with a cutthroat razor. because when you do that, you try to do the tip and it gouges out a sort of scoop. Then you turn it around and you get another scoop. It's highly recognizable. And then, of course, the lens breaks. So sometimes the pencil starts off like this and it shrinks down trying to sharpen it. I had a lot of fun trying to find a pencil sharpener for diaries. But I only found once someone had written a patent application for a diary pencil sharpener, but I've never seen an example of it. And I took it so seriously that there's a pencil sharpener museum in your country. Did you know that?
It doesn't surprise me.
It doesn't surprise me. Well, I wrote a letter to the gentleman who was very courteous, never seen a diary pencil sharpener, and was much taken with the idea that maybe he's dug one up since. But I did discover that if you have a normal pencil sharpener, if you're careful, you can sharpen a diary pencil just in the end. But I think a lot of people wrote in ink, like writing in ink. It's more satisfactory. A good fountain pen is the most. It used to be what people often got for their 18th birthday from their grandparents, wasn't it? A really good fountain pen. And you'd have it the whole of your life and it would serve you. Now, if you gave someone they'd look at you askance, what is this? And I'd rather have the money kind of look in their eye. But actually, a good fountain pen is a treasure and very important. Very important.
I have several, which I think mostly made by Parker, the more modern ones. But I also have silver ones that aren't fountain pens; they're dipping pens, and
I like doing that
Victorian.
Too.
Yeah,
I like doing that too. You know what you were saying about epigraphy in diaries of the 19th century, 1820s, and so forth. Lots of them have illustrations in, and it's another overlooked aspect of the history of draftsmanship that. Obviously, there was a time in Britain, certainly, where education, you'd have a governor, you'd have a tutor kind of situation, and you would be taught draftsmanship as one of the things that befitted a gentleman or a lady to do that. And early 19th century diaries, when people go on a holiday, they have a watercolor scene and ink drawings of a really high standard. I mean, no one today can do that. And it's something they didn't think, I mustn't muck this up because the whole diary will be ruined. I must be really careful. They just did it, And it's the Woman in White. Remember that it's written by the drawing master who was sent to that house in Yorkshire to teach, those drawing masters. So quite a lot of early 19th century diaries, as well as that beautiful script you mentioned, have illustrations, even watercolors in them. So they're never thrown away. Their booksellers sell them for a lot of money. So we never buy diaries; we only rescue them.
And it draws back to the very first question I asked. The drawing masters of the very ancient world, the Paleolithic, painting caves and trying to depict motion. And you mentioned how hard it is to depict motion, but they did, because if you look at cave paintings like Chauvet Cave in France, you see multiple legs as a kind of, it was actually called proto-cinema by the filmmaker Werner Herzog, a former guest on this show. And you see the movement, the evocation of the movement, but you also see, again, the symbol of the woman. You see, there is only one human depiction in that entire cave, and it is the woman. And it shows you that, what they were concerned about, fertility and, keeping the lines going and things like that.
Sure.
But the fact is, it's all human. We change our technology, but we don't change very much. What's your view on that?
I absolutely agree with it. I think that I believe there's a central human component dressed in cosmetic materials. So language, of course, race, color, religion, belief, they're all additions to the inner model. And the inner model is unchanging. That's what I think. And I would think, for example, the British Museum, which now feels self-conscious about itself and is trying to evolve itself, should take this as a point of the commonality between Homo sapiens in all its marvelous developments and versions and all the rest of it, so that people who went to that museum or anyone like that would feel part of the human race. That you'd see how humans had to deal with infants dying and difficulty in childbirth and starvation and beauty and makeup and tattoos and craftsmanship and ivory carving at times when millennia ago, when no one today could do anything like that. Even no one in the museum could ever do anything like they did. The work, these fantastic, beautiful things, and ugly things, and war, and the whole. I see the whole of it from the Paleolithic to now as a sort of tapestry, and the Homo sapiens inside it is an unchanging animal, which has some remarkable qualities and one fatal quality, which is it never learns from its experience. I think this is a great criticism. If I was to suggest remodeling, like the flood, that if you're going to design a slightly superior species, the human race has never learned from experience. If they'd never be another war. There'd never be another war. I mean, the fact that we're still doing.
No. If we learned from experience, war would have been long gone.
Yeah.
Yes. We would have only needed one.
We only needed one, or one in each continent. But the atrocities that you see now, and then there's the atrocities in the Second World War. But there were atrocities before. The Syrians might kill all the people, and they'd salt the earth and piss on everything and go home, and all those things, and with bloodlust and murder and rape and all that. They're all part of the human. It's all a tapestry. But the thing is that the thing about the human race, I don't know what we're talking about, but in my view, it has the most remarkable qualities, most of which are potential. And then it has a lot of disadvantages, most of which are absolutely present. And there's an imbalance between those two phenomena. And that is the tragedy of the human race, that there's never been a force from within which enables people to reverse that. That's what we need.
True. But, well, for example, diaries, human history is the diary of the human species, basically, what we know. But very rarely can we do a hyper-focused study like with the cave painters. We're missing over 99% of what they did because it was, it's gone, erased. We just have the cave paintings. And even then, we don't have all of them. We just have a smattering that happened to survive, which underscores the importance of diaries, because that is a hyperfocus of a certain period, human history. And in this age where data storage is becoming increasingly important and huge, storing our data and all of this stuff. But really, it's just accounting for the most part. It's like the cuneiform tablets, where it's nothing personal there. It's just, I'm trading this goat for whatever. Well, I'm converting US dollars to pound sterling, things like that. That's most of our data. But the really valuable stuff, the stuff that would function as diaries, less so today. And looking at the internet, you see some of that, but it's not quite the same.
It's not quite the same.
It's not quite the same, but it's a shame, because we're actually reverting in a way back to when people thought, well, that's not worth writing down. Thus it's not worth, the clay tablet or paying the scribe, things like that. And is that the reason, and this is my final question for you, is that the reason that stuff wasn't written down was because it was frivolous and the scribe was expensive, the literate person to write it down? And that's why things, literacy changed everything and allowed for the diary. But does it boil down to that it was just a matter of illiteracy, that they didn't preserve anything that was personal?
Well, in the cuneiform world, writing was done by a small number of persons, so there wasn't general literacy. The scribes were extremely literate, and the clever ones among them were immensely learned, but they were the scribes, like you have window cleaners or something like that. They did all the writing. And among their inscriptions, there is a noticeable dearth of personal writing. And I believe that the reason is within reach, because the trained intellectual scribe was always instructed to respect older writing. And the older the writing, the better. In fact, they sometimes say this came from before the flood. That's the highest praise they can give for a received piece of information from distant times. And so the role of the scribe in Mesopotamia, the learned scribe, the literary scribe, and the one who worked with medicine and with astrology and astronomy, is the preservation of knowledge, rather than using the cuneiform resource as a tabula rasa in order to experiment on. What they did was to preserve what had come from before, but they didn't use it for innovation. And so personal writing wouldn't fit, because your job was to preserve all the words, the dictionaries, the sign lists, the omens, the collected. It was copied and copied and copied, and preserved. Sometimes commentaries are written on it and explanations are written on it, all that sort of learned material. But the writing was, in some respects, backward-looking. And it might well be, although also this is another dodgy idea, but it's not impossible, that in the middle of the first millennium, from about 700 BC, Aramaic, which was related to Babylonian, which was the prevailing language, became more and more used. And when the Persians took over the Middle East, they used Aramaic as their central language among all the countries they ran. So Aramaic got bigger and bigger. And Aramaic was written with an alphabet. And it's the same alphabet that was used, same basic alphabet used for Hebrew and Phoenician and so forth. The kind of curly scripts you do with an ink thing on a flat surface. They wrote Aramaic with 26 letters. We have some tablets with Aramaic in ink written on them. And I have an idea that if you had a doctor, for example, who noticed that when somebody had an arrow in their stomach in a battle, and if it got torn open, you'd see there was a liver and a stomach and things that they knew that were in sheep, and that there was a parallel between human structure of anatomy, and might want to write something about it and make notes on it. He might do it in Aramaic rather than in the cuneiform on clay. If he did, of course, it would be in a perishable material, that dreadful, fearful expression, the dreadful thing, perishable. So, for example, there are tablets that say this was copied from a parchment scroll. And if it's true, and it was done in Aramaic, done in ink, probably they painted the cuneiform signs with a brush or with a nib. They wrote the cuneiform on the parchment. So we know they had perishable materials, but none of those survive. And also on ivory and things like that. So it's possible that, for example, the famous Library of Assyria, which is written by the best scribes in the world, and it's an encyclopedic study of everything there, lexical texts and omens, and rows and rows and rows of things, all from before and preserved and kept up to date. It's possible that at the same time there was a lively, completely different use of writing on something which didn't survive. And I believe this to be likely, because I find it surprising that so much of the writing is preservative and copying, and not, I wonder what would happen if you did this, I wonder what would happen if you did that, or somebody told me this, or somebody told me that. So it's possible that we can see that maybe in the court in Assyria, maybe they all spoke Aramaic and not Babylonian, not Assyrian and Babylonian. We don't know. Maybe one day they'll find a well with hundreds of rolls in, and we can get a bit of information. So again, it's the same question that is vulnerable. But the absence of personal literature, private literature, speculative literature, all those interesting things, synthesizing literature, this is the other thing, because we have thousands of medical recipes arranged from head to foot, but there's no synthesis of the inherent truth of everything, or the inherent benefit of medicine or procedure. We just have the stuff, the data. And in a way, you might expect there to be indices and things of this kind and perhaps that's the explanation, that you could write quickly in ink, roll it up and something like that. We don't know, but I think one has to just have an open mind about the possibilities. But actually, it's a very good question that you asked, because it's conspicuous that the writing is looking backwards. It's conspicuous. What was the other question you asked me about related to this? There was another part to your question about 25 minutes ago. I can't remember.
About 25, but I got sidetracked because I was thinking about perishable. First of all, most diaries are perishable. Perishable writing, they will rot in a landfill if they get
if they're in a landfill, they're lost.
Yes, or they get eaten by worms, or whatever. Even just things like medieval writing with iron gall ink eating through the paper.
That's right.
The reactivity. But you look back to the Romans, most of their personal writing was in wax. They would make wax tablets and they would write on that. And look at how much actual official Roman literature is missing, in Greco, the Greeks as well, where somebody will mention something in the Middle Ages, a monk, copying something, and he'll put a quote in there. But the original book is gone. So I don't think you're quite off base there, that maybe they did have a more personal way of writing, or a more pedestrian way. Yeah.
Oh, but also they have to, if we have the argument that we're all human beings together, because there's a kind of blank side of their intellectual mind, which is writing based and lexical based and with lexical precision. It's kind of strange that there isn't anything. So that might be. Also, they did have wax tablets because they've been found in wells. So you have a panel of ivory with a frame, and then the inside flat part is scored across with a knife so that the wax would grip. And when Malouin was digging at Nimrud, they found some of these tablets with the wax still there, with cuneiform on it. Amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. And all through Mesopotamian stuff, there are references to wax things. So maybe they were commonplace. And it's the same problem of evaluating the incidence and the extent and the importance of a certain property when all they have is this fortuitous matter of what survives. It's very true. Our idea is to make sure diaries never get into landfill. That's the very important thing. There are lots of things that can go. Is it gone?
No, we're still here.
Oh, good. I suddenly got things saying Zoom workplace. Oh, good. Yes. Whew, what a relief. Yes. Anyway, it's good fun. But actually, there ought to be, I know 2 or 3 people who are interested in America in the diary matter. And maybe something can be done before it's too late, because America is such a diary-keeping nation. It will be a pity. And they have these lovely little things with a flap that tucks in. And even farmers who write in there with their big laborious letters. I have a diary from the middle of Iowa where someone wrote, "Saw one of those motor cars today." That kind of big writing, from a long way away. They probably heard it and said, "Wife, come and see," something like that. Very fascinating. Very fascinating.
It really is. And I hope somebody in the audience, there are a lot of academics out there and people that like to collect things. Maybe we should do this for the U.S. and start collecting people's diaries, unwanted diaries, so that they don't get lost. Dr. Finkel, thank you for joining us today. This was amazing. And I hope you'll come back and update us on the Great Diary Project and your work.
Anytime. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And when you come to the British Museum, you must come and bang on my door and we'll have a conversation there.
You bet. Absolutely. I will take you up on that, because I have not been to Britain nearly enough, because you could go to, as medieval historian interest in that, I would never be able to see all of Britain in a lifetime.
Well, that's true, but you can't really see the whole of America in a lifetime. I mean, I think it would be good fun. We'll have a long cup of tea and a long conversation. All right.
Absolutely. Looking forward
to it.
Thank you,
Be
sir.
well. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.